Before I begin, let me just say that the whispers in a family can be far louder than any shout from a stranger. I learned that lesson late in life, but I learned it well. My son, Mark, and his wife, Clarissa, they had a way of making me feel small, especially after my Arthur passed. They said, "Shut up, you widow," during what was supposed to be a family dinner in my own home. They thought my grief had rendered me deaf, dumb, and blind to their intentions. But they underestimated the quiet strength that comes from a life lived, from promises kept, and from a love that death itself couldn't erase. I left that dinner, and the very next day they discovered that the widow they sought to silence held all the strings. They lost everything. This is the story of how I took back not just my dignity but my life. Perhaps you'll understand. Perhaps you've felt that sting of being utterly misjudged. It had been 3 years since Arthur, my husband of 52 years, had left this world. 52 years of shared laughter, quiet evenings, and the meticulous building of a life, a home, and a modest but successful business in bespoke carpentry, Arthur's Fine Furnishings. He had a craftsman's soul, Arthur did, and every piece he made held a story, a bit of his heart. I was his sounding board, his bookkeeper, his partner in every sense. When he fell ill, our son Mark and his wife Clarissa were present. That's the kindest word I can use. They lived nearby, in a rather lovely house that Arthur and I had helped them secure the down payment for, a fact that seemed to slip their minds with increasing frequency. Mark had a position in Arthur's company, a managerial role Arthur had hoped he would grow into, to eventually take the reins. Clarissa, well, Clarissa had opinions, mostly about how things could be done better, faster, and more profitably, often with less sentimentality. She saw Arthur's dedication to quality and his loyal, aging workforce as inefficiencies. After Arthur's passing, the weight of everything fell onto my shoulders. The grief, the business, the sudden silence in a house that had always hummed with his presence. I tried to keep things as Arthur would have wanted, but Mark, egged on by Clarissa, began to push for changes. Modernization, they called it. I called it stripping the soul from Arthur's legacy. I owned the majority shares, a fact Arthur had meticulously arranged to protect me, something I was only dimly aware of at the time, trusting him implicitly. My world had shrunk to the four walls of our home, filled with memories and the twice-weekly visits to Arthur's grave. Mark and Clarissa's visits became less about comfort and more, it seemed, about assessing my decline. They'd talk over me, their voices pitched as if I weren't quite there, or perhaps as if my opinions no longer carried weight. "Mother needs to simplify," Clarissa would say to Mark right in front of me. "This big house, all this responsibility with the business, it's too much for her." I'd offer them tea, the good china Arthur and I had bought on our honeymoon, and they'd barely notice, already discussing their plans for the weekend or a new car they were considering. The sacrifices I'd made for Mark, for their family, the Christmases I'd hosted single-handedly after my own mother passed, the school fees I'd quietly supplemented when Mark was between jobs before Arthur took him in, the endless babysitting of their two children, Leo and Mia, when they were younger, children who now barely acknowledged me, all seemed to have evaporated from their memory. I wasn't bitter, not then, just tired, and increasingly invisible. The dinner was supposed to be a simple affair. It was the anniversary of Arthur's passing, and I, foolishly perhaps, had hoped for a quiet evening of remembrance, maybe even a shared story or two about him. I'd made his favorite pot roast. The aroma filled the house, a ghost of happier times. Mark and Clarissa arrived late, flustered, arguing quietly but intensely as they came through the door about something to do with a missed reservation at some new, trendy restaurant they'd rather have been at. Leo and Mia, now teenagers, were glued to their phones, offering mumbled greetings. The atmosphere was strained from the start. I tried to steer the conversation towards Arthur, to reminisce. "Remember that time your father took us all camping, Mark, and it rained for 3 solid days?" I began, a small smile on my face at the memory of Arthur's unflappable good humor even then. Mark grunted, spearing a potato. "Yeah, vaguely. It was a disaster, wasn't it? Clarissa chimed in, her voice sharp. Honestly, Eleanor, must we dredge up the past? It's been 3 years. Life moves on. Her use of my first name, once a gesture of adult inclusion, now felt like a dismissal. I felt a familiar pang but pressed on, my voice softer. It's his day. I thought we could share some fond memories, Leo snorted from behind his screen. Mia didn't even look up. The pot roast, which had smelled so comforting, suddenly felt heavy in my stomach. The conversation, or lack thereof, limped along. Mark and Clarissa spoke mostly to each other about their friends, their investments, a planned holiday to some exotic location I couldn't quite afford, even if I'd had the inclination to travel alone. I felt like a piece of old furniture, something to be politely ignored until it was time to clear the room. Then Mark brought up the business. Mother, we really need to talk about Arthur's fine furnishings. It's stagnant. Clarissa has some excellent ideas for restructuring. Streamlining. We need to make it profitable for the 21st century, not a museum. But Arthur always valued his employees, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He knew all their families. Some of them have been with us for decades. Clarissa laughed, a short, brittle sound. Eleanor, sentimentality doesn't pay the bills. We're talking about a significant asset here. An asset that, frankly, you're not equipped to manage anymore. That stung, deeply. Arthur had trusted me. He'd believed in my judgment. I am still the majority shareholder, Clarissa. I reminded her, perhaps a little more firmly than I intended. And I believe Arthur's values are what made the company special. Mark sighed, a put-upon sound he'd perfected. Mother, be reasonable. We're trying to help you, to secure your future and ours. If things continue as they are, there won't be much left to worry about. His eyes flicked towards Clarissa, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was then, in that shared glance, that I saw it, the collusion, the impatience, the barely veiled greed. A cold knot formed in my chest. I wanted to speak about Arthur, about his legacy, about respect. I wanted to tell them how much their words, their attitude, hurt. I opened my mouth, a plea for understanding forming on my lips. Arthur would have wanted. Clarissa cut me off, her voice like chipped ice. Oh, for heaven's sake, Eleanor. Arthur is gone. It's time you accepted that. You're a widow. Just shut up, you widow. The words hung in the air, stark and brutal. Shut up, you widow. Not mother, not Eleanor, just you widow. As if that defined me, erased everything else I was, everything I had been. As if my grief, my status, was a muzzle. Mark didn't flinch, he didn't defend me. He just looked down at his plate, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Leo actually looked up from his phone, a flicker of something, shock, amusement, in his eyes before quickly looking away. Mia remained oblivious. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. The aroma of pot roast now seemed cloying, sickening. I looked at my son, the baby I had nursed, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed better, the man whose wedding I had wept at with joy. I saw a stranger. I looked at Clarissa, her face triumphant, smug. And in that moment, something inside me, something that had been slowly eroding for 3 years, finally shattered. But beneath the shards of pain, something else began to stir. A cold, hard clarity. I slowly placed my napkin on the table. My hands were trembling, but my voice, when I finally spoke, was surprisingly steady. You are right, Clarissa, I said, my gaze fixed on her. Arthur is gone. And perhaps it is time I accepted certain things. I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping harshly in the sudden quiet. Thank you for dinner, such as it was. I find I'm rather tired. I stood up, my legs feeling a little unsteady but my spine rigid. I walked out of the dining room, down the hall, and into my bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. I didn't hear them leave. I didn't care. That night, sleep was impossible. The words, "Shut up, you widow," echoed in my mind, a cruel refrain. But with each repetition, the pain began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning anger, and then something more potent, resolve. They saw a frail old woman, lost in her grief. They saw a widow. They would soon learn just how resourceful a widow could be. The dawn that followed that dreadful dinner was gray and unforgiving, much like the mood that had settled over me. The house felt cavernous, the silence no longer peaceful but charged with the residue of last night's cruelty. Clarissa's words, "Shut up, you widow," replayed relentlessly, each syllable a fresh stab. But with the morning light, something shifted. The raw wound of it began to scar over, not with healing flesh, but with a hardened resolve. They thought my widowhood was a weakness, a sign that my useful life was over. They were about to discover it was the very source of my overlooked strength. Arthur, bless his methodical soul, had not been a man of grand romantic gestures, but his love was in the details, in the quiet acts of provision. He had always said, "Eleanor, you're smarter than you let on. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small." And in his final years, knowing his time was limited, he had meticulously arranged his affairs, not just for my comfort, but for my protection. He'd sat me down, papers spread across the dining table, the very table where I'd been so casually dismissed, and explained the structure of the business, the trusts, the investments. I'd listened, nodded, signed where he indicated, my mind more on the precious time we had left than on the intricacies of legal jargon. "This is important, Ellie," he'd said, his voice serious. "This ensures you call the shots, no one else." Now, his words came back to me with stunning clarity. I rose from my bed, the usual aches and stiffness of age momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of purpose. I went to Arthur's old roll-top desk in the study, a magnificent piece he'd crafted himself. Untouched since his passing, it was a shrine of sorts. I opened the main compartment, the scent of old wood and his favorite tobacco faintly lingering. There, in a neatly labeled file marked Eleanor, Personal and Business Holdings, was everything: wills, deeds, share certificates, trust documents. For hours, I sat there, not as a grieving widow, but as a woman betrayed, a woman underestimated, a woman rediscovering her power. The coffee grew cold beside me as I pored over the papers. Arthur hadn't just left me provided for, he'd left me in control. Arthur's fine furnishings, I held 70% of the shares. The family home was mine outright. The house Mark and Clarissa lived in? It was owned by a family trust, of which I was the sole trustee with full discretionary powers, a detail Arthur had put in place when he'd helped them with it, just in case, he'd said. With a foresight that now seemed prophetic. Even a significant portion of Mark's salary from the business was structured as a discretionary bonus, approved by the majority shareholder, me. A slow, cold smile touched my lips. It wasn't a smile of malice, not entirely. It was the smile of dawning realization, the kind that comes when the pieces of a complex puzzle finally click into place. They had wanted to silence the widow. They had no idea the widow held the pen that could rewrite their entire lives. My first call was not to a friend, though the thought of confiding in Martha, my oldest companion, was tempting. No, this required a different kind of counsel. I looked up the number for Arthur's solicitor, a formidable woman named Monica Albright. Arthur had always spoken highly of her. "Sharp as a tack, that Monica," he'd say. "Doesn't suffer fools." I dialed. Her secretary put me through almost immediately. "Mrs. Davies, Eleanor. How lovely to hear from you, though I wish it were under better circumstances, generally speaking." Monica's voice was crisp, professional, yet with an undercurrent of warmth. I remembered her from Arthur's funeral, a pillar of quiet strength. "Monica?" I said, my voice steady. "I need to see you, urgently. It's about Arthur's estate and subsequent arrangements." "Of course, Eleanor. How is tomorrow morning, say 10 o'clock? "My office?" "Perfect," I replied. As I hung up, a wave of something akin to grief washed over me, but it was different this time. It was grief for the son I thought I had, for the family I believed we were. But beneath it, the bedrock of resolve held firm. They had drawn a line in the sand with their cruelty. I was simply choosing to step over it, onto solid ground of my own making. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet activity. I ate a small, belated breakfast, the pot roast from last night long since discarded. I tidied the house, not with my usual gentle care, but with a brisk efficiency. Each polished surface, each plumped cushion felt like an act of reclaiming my space, my life. There were no calls from Mark or Clarissa, no apologies, no checking to see if I was all right. Their silence was as telling as their words had been. They assumed I was nursing my hurt, an old woman retreating further into her shell. They had no idea I was, in fact, preparing for battle. A quiet, dignified battle, but a battle nonetheless. The next morning, I dressed with care, not in the muted grays and lavenders I'd favored since Arthur's passing, but in a smart navy blue dress, one he'd always liked. I even put on a touch of lipstick. Looking in the mirror, I saw not just a widow, but Eleanor Davies, a woman with a history, a purpose, and, as it turned out, considerable resources. Monica Albright's office was in a sleek, modern building downtown, a far cry from the dusty, cluttered law offices of old. Monica herself was exactly as Arthur had described, sharp, impeccably dressed, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She greeted me with a firm handshake and led me into a comfortable, light-filled meeting room overlooking the city. "Coffee, Eleanor?" she offered. "Or tea?" "Tea would be lovely, thank you, Monica," I replied, taking a seat. Once the tea was served and we were alone, Monica leaned forward slightly. "Now, Eleanor, you said it was urgent. Tell me what's on your mind." And so, I did. I recounted the dinner. The exact words Clarissa had used, "Shut up, you widow." I didn't embellish, I didn't get overly emotional, though I could feel a tightness in my chest as I spoke. I simply laid out the facts, the years of subtle and not so subtle disrespect, the entitlement, the clear desire to push me aside and take control of Arthur's legacy for their own benefit. Monica listened patiently, her expression neutral, though I saw a flicker of something, perhaps sympathy or professional indignation, in her eyes when I repeated Clarissa's insult. When I had finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Monica said, "Eleanor, first, I am so very sorry you were subjected to that. No one deserves such disrespect, least of all from their own family." She paused, then continued. "Arthur was a very astute man. He loved you deeply, and he foresaw, well, let's just say he put measures in place to ensure your autonomy and security were paramount. I remember our discussions vividly. He was adamant that you should always be in the driver's seat." She opened a file she had waiting on the table. "I took the liberty of reviewing the core documents pertaining to Arthur's estate and the associated trusts after your call. Your recollection is perfectly accurate. You are the majority shareholder of Arthur's fine furnishings. The matrimonial home is yours, unencumbered. And yes, the property your son and his wife reside in is held by the Davies Family Trust, and you, as sole trustee, have complete discretionary power over that asset, including the right to occupy or dispose of it as you see fit." My heart gave a little thump. Hearing it all laid out so clinically, so legally, solidified the power I held. "Mark's remuneration from the company," Monica continued, tapping a clause in one of the documents, "includes a significant portion designated as a performance-based bonus, payable at the discretion of the board, which, given your shareholding, effectively means at your discretion. His base salary, without that bonus, is considerably more modest." I absorbed this, a cold sort of calm settling over me. "So what you're saying, Monica, is that if I chose to, I could make significant changes." "Eleanor," Monica said, her gaze direct, "you could make fundamental changes. You could remove Mark from his position in the company. You could cease the discretionary bonus payments. You could, with appropriate notice, require them to vacate the property owned by the trust. Legally, your position is exceptionally strong." The words hung in the air. This wasn't just about teaching them a lesson anymore. This was about safeguarding Arthur's legacy, about reclaiming my own peace and dignity, and about ensuring that those who had shown such callous disregard for me would no longer benefit from my goodwill or Arthur's hard work. What would be involved? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. If I wanted to exercise these rights? Monica outlined the procedures. Formal notices, board resolutions, letters drafted with precise legal wording. It was all quite straightforward, she explained, because Arthur had ensured it would be. As she spoke, my mind flashed back to countless instances of their dismissiveness, their casual cruelty. Clarissa's constant critiques of my housekeeping, my cooking, my outdated views. Mark's impatience when I'd ask a question about the business, his assumption that I wouldn't understand. Their expectation that I would always be there, a silent, compliant benefactor. "Shut up, you widow," the phrase echoed again. But this time, it didn't sting. It fueled. "Monica," I said, taking a deep breath. "I want to proceed. I want to remove Mark from his managerial position at Arthur's Fine Furnishings. I want to suspend his discretionary bonus, effective immediately. And I want to issue a formal notice for them to vacate the trust property." I saw a flicker of surprise in Monica's eyes, quickly masked by professionalism. "Are you certain, Eleanor? These are significant steps. There will be repercussions." "I am certain," I replied, my voice unwavering. "They have made their position clear. Now I will make mine." While Monica began to draft the necessary documents, my phone buzzed in my handbag. It was Mark. I ignored it. A few minutes later, another buzz. Clarissa. I ignored that too. They were likely wondering why I wasn't answering, perhaps annoyed that I wasn't available to cater to some forgotten need or query. They had no idea that the widow they had so contemptuously dismissed was, at that very moment, carefully dismantling the foundations of their comfortable, entitled lives. Monica explained that the process would be swift. Certain actions, like the suspension of the bonus, could be immediate. The removal from his position would follow company protocol but could be expedited given my controlling interest. The notice to vacate the property would require a standard period, 30 days, but it would be irrevocable. "We can have the initial notifications prepared and sent by courier by the end of today," Monica said. "They will likely receive them tomorrow morning." Tomorrow morning, the day after they told me to shut up, the irony was not lost on me. It wasn't a pleasant feeling, this dismantling. There was a grim satisfaction, yes, but also a profound sadness for what was irrevocably broken. But Arthur's face swam before my eyes, his kind smile, his unwavering belief in me. I was doing this not just for myself but for him, for the values he stood for the legacy he had entrusted to me. The legacy they sought to twist and exploit. The rest of that day with Monica was spent meticulously going over every detail. She was a marvel of efficiency and calm, explaining the legal ramifications of each step, ensuring I understood the process thoroughly. We discussed the future of Arthur's Fine Furnishings. With Mark removed, I would need to take a more active role, at least initially. Perhaps I would appoint an interim manager, someone who respected Arthur's ethos. Or perhaps, I mused, I would find a new passion in steering the company myself, ensuring it reflected his vision, not Clarissa's rapacious desire for profit at any cost. Monica helped me draft letters. One to the board of Arthur's Fine Furnishings, which, effectively, was a notification to myself and the company secretary, outlining the immediate termination of Mark's discretionary bonus and initiating the process for his dismissal from his managerial role due to a loss of confidence by the Quiddus majority shareholder. Another letter, addressed to Mark and Clarissa Davies, was a formal 30-day notice to vacate the property at 12 Willow Creek Lane, owned by the Davies Family Trust. A third, shorter letter informed Mark that his access to the company credit card and expense accounts was immediately suspended. Each word was chosen with care, precise and irrefutable. There was no anger in the language, no recrimination, just cold, hard facts and legal necessities. It felt like signing off on a chapter of my life, a painful one, but necessary for the next to begin. As I put my signature on each document, my hand was surprisingly steady. The tremor that had plagued me since the dinner party was gone, replaced by a firm resolve. I remembered all the times I had signed checks for Mark's school trips, for down payments, for little emergencies that always seemed to crop up in his life. Those signatures had been acts of love, of maternal support. These new signatures were acts of self-preservation, of reclaiming what was mine. While Monica's assistant organized the couriers, I sat quietly, sipping a fresh cup of tea. My phone buzzed again, then again. Mark. Clarissa. Then a text message from Mark. Mother, where are you? Clarissa is worried. Call us. Worried. The irony was almost laughable. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about what my silence, my unavailability might mean for them. Their concern was always, I now saw with painful clarity, transactional. Monica returned. All set, Eleanor. The couriers will deliver these first thing in the morning, one to their home address, one to Mark at the office. Thank you, Monica, I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders, even as a new, different kind of weight settled in, the weight of consequences, of irrevocable change. You've been a true lifeline. Arthur wouldn't have had it any other way, she said with a small, understanding smile. And frankly, Eleanor, it's empowering to see someone take back their control after being so poorly treated. Her words resonated. Empowering. Yes, that's what it felt like. Not vengeful, but as if I was finally standing up straight after being stooped for too long. On the drive home, the city seemed sharper, the colors more vivid. I noticed things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The way the sunlight caught the leaves on the trees, the intricate architecture of an old building, the smiles on people's faces. It was as if a veil had been lifted. That evening, I made myself a simple omelet and a salad. I ate at the small kitchen table, not in the grand dining room that now held such bitter memories. I didn't turn on the television. Instead, I picked up a book of poetry Arthur had loved, one I hadn't opened in years. The words, familiar and comforting, filled the quiet spaces of the house. There were no more calls from Mark or Clarissa. Perhaps they had given up, assuming I was having one of my moods, as Clarissa sometimes dismissively called my quiet days. Or perhaps, on some subconscious level, they sensed a shift, a change in the currents they couldn't quite name. I went to bed early, not with the dread of another sleepless night, but with a sense of weary peace. The storm was coming, I knew that. Tomorrow would bring their shock, their anger, their disbelief. But I had weathered storms before, and this time, I was the one holding the tiller. Arthur had taught me about the grain of wood, how to work with it, not against it, to create something strong and beautiful. My family, it seemed, had a grain that ran contrary to respect, to gratitude. I had tried for too long to work against that grain. Now I was simply letting the natural consequences unfold. The widow they had tried to silence was about to speak, not with words of hurt or pleading, but with the undeniable language of action. The next morning, I woke before dawn, a habit ingrained from years of rising with Arthur. The house was still, wrapped in the pre-dawn hush. I made myself a pot of strong coffee and sat by the kitchen window, watching the sky slowly lighten from inky black to bruised purple, then to a soft, hopeful rose. I didn't feel anxious, not exactly. It was more a feeling of inevitability, like watching a tide turn. The actions set in motion were now beyond my recall, and a strange sort of calm accompanied that knowledge. Around 8:30, my own doorbell rang. It was a courier with a package for me, a courtesy copy of the documents Monica had sent to Mark and Clarissa. I signed for it, my hand steady. So, the originals would be arriving at Willow Creek Lane and Arthur's Fine Furnishings around the same time. The overture was complete, the opera was about to begin. I didn't have to wait long. At precisely 9:17, my phone erupted with a call from Mark. His name flashed on the screen, and for a moment I hesitated. Then I answered, keeping my voice calm and even. "Hello, Mark. Mother? What in God's name is this?" His voice was tight, incredulous, already laced with an anger he was barely attempting to control. "What are you talking about?" This, this letter from Monica Albright saying my bonus is suspended and something about my job and another one about the house? This is some kind of sick joke, right?" I could hear Clarissa's shrill voice in the background, demanding to know what was going on. "It's no joke, Mark," I said quietly. "It's all perfectly legal and binding. Monica has handled everything." "But why? What have we done?" The sheer audacity of the question almost made me laugh. "What have you done?" He sounded genuinely bewildered, as if the events of the dinner 2 nights ago, the years of casual disregard, had simply not registered as offensive or consequential. "Mark," I said, my voice devoid of the warmth he was accustomed to, "I think you know why, or perhaps you don't. Perhaps you're so insulated by your own entitlement that you genuinely can't see it. But your actions, and Clarissa's, have consequences." "Clarissa! What does she have to do with this? That dinner? You're doing all this because of a few misunderstood words at dinner?" "Misunderstood words?" I repeated, a chill in my tone. "Shut up, you widow. Was that misunderstood, Mark, or was it the clearest thing Clarissa has said to me in years?" And your silence, your tacit approval, spoke volumes. There was a sputtering sound on the other end of the line. "But this is insane! You can't just kick us out of our house. You can't fire me. Dad wanted me to run the company." "Arthur wanted the company to be run with integrity and respect, Mark, values you and Clarissa seem to have forgotten. And as the majority shareholder and the sole trustee of the Davies Family Trust, I can, and I am, making these changes. The house, as you know, or should know if you ever paid attention to such details, belongs to the trust. And I, as trustee, am exercising my discretion." "You have 30 days!" Clarissa's voice cut in then, snatching the phone from Mark. "Eleanor! You venomous old woman! How dare you, after everything we've done for you?" "Done for me, Clarissa?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "Or done to me? Because from where I'm standing, the ledger looks rather different. We looked after you, we visited," she shrieked. "We put up with your endless stories about Arthur." The sheer, unadulterated nerve of it was breathtaking. "You will regret this, Eleanor. Mark will fight this. We have rights." "I suggest you consult a solicitor, Clarissa," I said calmly. "Monica Albright is very thorough. I believe you'll find my position is unassailable. Now I have things to attend to." And with that, I ended the call. My hand was trembling slightly now, not from fear, but from the release of long-suppressed emotion. The dam had broken. Almost immediately, the phone rang again. "Mark." I let it go to voicemail. Then Clarissa. Voicemail, then Mark again. This continued for the better part of an hour. Texts started to flood in too, a torrent of disbelief, outrage, threats, and then, eventually, something akin to pleading. I read none of them. I made myself another cup of coffee and went into the garden. The roses Arthur had planted were in bloom, their scent sweet and heavy in the morning air. I snipped a few, their thorns pricking my fingers, a small, sharp pain that felt grounding. This wasn't just about the insult, as monumental as it was. It was about a pattern, a slow, creeping annexation of my life, my autonomy, my husband's legacy. It was about their assumption that the widow was a passive entity, a resource to be managed and eventually consumed. They had forgotten that this widow had a mind, a will, and thanks to Arthur's foresight, the power to act. The peace I felt was profound, but it was tinged with a deep, aching sadness for the son I had lost long before I signed those papers. The initial barrage of calls and texts eventually subsided, replaced by an ominous silence that lasted for most of the afternoon. I imagined the frantic consultations happening at Willow Creek Lane, the disbelief giving way to dawning horror as they perhaps contacted their own lawyer, who would have quickly confirmed the grim reality of their situation. Monica had been clear. Arthur's arrangements were watertight. There were no loopholes for them to exploit. Around 4 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I wasn't surprised. Through the peephole, I saw them, Mark, his face pale and drawn, and Clarissa, her expression a mask of fury. For a moment, I considered not answering, letting them stew on the doorstep. But no, this was a confrontation that needed to happen, a final act in this painful drama. I opened the door. "Mother?" Mark began, his voice hoarse, stripped of its usual confident bluster. We need to talk, properly. Clarissa pushed past him, her eyes blazing. You can't do this, Eleanor. This is our home, Mark's career. You're destroying our lives. I led them not into the formal living room, but into the sunroom at the back of the house. A bright, airy space filled with plants, a room Arthur and I had often used for quiet conversation. I remained standing. They stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, suddenly looking out of place, diminished. I believe my solicitor's letters were quite clear. I stated, keeping my tone neutral. There isn't much more to discuss. Clear? Mark choked out. They're devastating. Mother, how could you? After everything Dad did for us, for me, he wanted me to take over the business. Arthur wanted the business to thrive under principled leadership, Mark. I corrected him gently. He also wanted me to be secure and respected. You and Clarissa have made it abundantly clear that you value neither his principles nor my well-being. That's not true. Clarissa interjected, her voice rising. We care about you. This is just a misunderstanding. We were stressed that night. We didn't mean what we said. You didn't mean shut up, you widow? I asked, looking directly at her. Her eyes flickered away, a faint flush rising on her cheeks. It was a stupid thing to say, okay? I apologize. There, are you happy now? Can we just forget this whole ridiculous thing and go back to how things were? Go back? I echoed, a sad smile playing on my lips. Clarissa, there is no going back. Some words, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. Some actions, once taken, cannot be undone. You opened my eyes to the reality of our relationship, a reality I had perhaps been avoiding for too long. Mark finally spoke, his voice low, almost pleading. Mother, please. Think about Leo and Mia. What will this do to them? Their home, their security. It was a low blow, using the children. But I had anticipated it. Leo and Mia are old enough to understand that actions have consequences, Mark. Perhaps this will be a valuable life lesson for them. As for their security, that is now your responsibility, as it always should have been. You've relied on Arthur's legacy, and my passive acceptance, for far too long. I saw a flicker of the old arrogance in Mark's eyes. I'll fight this, you know. I'll get a lawyer. I'll contest Arthur's will. You are welcome to try, I said calmly. Monica Albright is an excellent solicitor. She assures me Arthur's wishes were made impeccably clear and are legally sound. Wasting money on legal fees will only diminish whatever resources you have left. Clarissa sank onto the edge of a wicker chair, her fight seeming to drain out of her, replaced by a dawning despair. Our friends, what will people say? We'll be ruined. Her concern, as ever, was for appearances, for their social standing. That, Clarissa, is a consequence of your own making, I said, not unkindly, but firmly. Perhaps you should have considered that before you treated the widow with such contempt. Mark looked around the sunroom, his gaze lingering on a photograph of Arthur and me, taken on our 50th anniversary, both of us beaming. His face crumpled. I don't understand, he whispered more to himself than to me. I don't understand how it came to this. And that, I realized, was the heart of the tragedy. He genuinely didn't understand. He had been so immersed in his own entitlement, so convinced of his inherent right to his father's legacy and my unending support, that he couldn't comprehend that his own actions, his own disrespect, I had brought about this downfall. There was a long silence. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a clock Arthur had lovingly restored. You have 30 days to vacate Willow Creek Lane, I said finally, my voice softer now but no less resolute. And Mark, your employment with Arthur's Fine Furnishings is terminated, effective as per the company's policies, which Monica will clarify. Your final salary payment will be processed accordingly. There is nothing more to say. Mark looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding. Clarissa just stared blankly ahead, the fight gone, replaced by a look of utter desolation. They left without another word. I watched them walk down the garden path, no longer the confident, entitled couple who had dismissed me so casually, but two people facing the harsh reality of their own creation. There was no triumph in that moment, only a profound and aching sadness. The ties that bind a family are strong, but even the strongest ties can be frayed by disrespect and severed by contempt. They had made their choices, now I had made mine. The days that followed their visit were quiet, almost unnervingly so. The phone remained silent. No more desperate calls, no angry texts. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm and a landscape irrevocably altered. I occupied myself with small tasks around the house and garden, finding a strange comfort in the familiar routines. I also began to think more concretely about the future of Arthur's fine furnishings. Monica helped me identify an interim manager, a semi-retired craftsman named David Henderson, who had worked with Arthur for over 20 years and shared his deep respect for quality and integrity. David was humbled and honored by the offer, and I felt a sense of relief knowing the company was in capable, trustworthy hands for the time being. The 30-day notice period for Mark and Clarissa to vacate Willow Creek Lane seemed to pass both slowly and with astonishing speed. I had no contact with them during this time, and I didn't seek it. Monica handled any necessary communications through their solicitor, which I learned they had indeed retained, though it seemed their lawyer had quickly advised them of the futility of any legal challenge. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into the notice period, I was pruning the roses when I saw a large moving van pull up outside 12 Willow Creek Lane, which was visible from the end of my garden. I watched, unseen, as furniture was loaded onto the truck. Mark was there, directing the movers, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with a weariness I had never seen in him before. Clarissa was nowhere to be seen. Later, I heard from Martha, who still had connections in the neighborhood, that Clarissa had gone to stay with her sister in another state, taking Leo and Mia with her. The facade of their perfect life had crumbled completely. The day they were due to hand over the keys, Monica's office received them via courier. There was no note, no final confrontation. Just the keys in an envelope. It was over. That evening, I walked over to Willow Creek Lane. The house stood empty, echoing, and cold. Dust motes danced in the fading sunlight that streamed through the bare windows. Signs of a hasty departure were everywhere, a forgotten child's toy in a corner, faint marks on the walls where pictures had hung. It was a ghost of a home, a testament to a life unraveled. There was no satisfaction in seeing it, only a quiet melancholy. This house, which Arthur and I had helped them acquire with such high hopes, had become a symbol of their entitlement and, ultimately, their loss. I arranged for a cleaning service and for the property to be aired out. Monica advised me on its future. I could rent it out or sell it. The trust documents gave me options. For now, I decided to simply let it be, to let the dust settle both literally and figuratively. News of Mark's dismissal and their sudden departure rippled through our small community. There were whispers, conjectures. I offered no explanations beyond what was necessary. To those who asked, I simply said that Mark was pursuing other opportunities and that family circumstances had necessitated a change. I felt no need to air our dirty laundry, nor to justify my actions to anyone beyond myself and Arthur's memory. My own life began to find a new rhythm. The oppressive weight of their expectations, their subtle but constant undermining, was gone. I started inviting Martha and other old friends over for tea more often. I rejoined the book club I'd abandoned years ago. I even started taking watercolor classes at the local community center, something I'd always wanted to do but never felt I had the time for. Slowly, a sense of peace, genuine and profound, began to settle over me. It wasn't the giddy peace of victory, but the quiet contentment of a battle fought and won, a battle for my own dignity and for the integrity of what Arthur and I had built together. I knew Mark and Clarissa were facing a difficult road. Their lifestyle had been predicated on an income and a home they no longer possessed. Their social standing, so important to Clarissa, would undoubtedly suffer. I didn't rejoice in their hardship, but I didn't feel responsible for it either. They had sown the seeds of their own misfortune with their greed and their disrespect. A few months later, Monica called to update me on the final disposition of Mark's affairs with the company. All dues had been settled. She also mentioned, discreetly, that she'd heard Mark had found some sort of junior position in a different city, a significant step down from his role at Arthur's Fine Furnishings. Clarissa, it seemed, had not yet returned. Their children, Leo and Mia, were apparently struggling with the upheaval. I felt a pang for them, innocent victims in their parents' drama, but I knew I couldn't shield them from the consequences of Mark and Clarissa's choices. My responsibility was to the legacy Arthur had entrusted to me and to my own hard-won peace. One crisp autumn morning, I was sitting in the sunroom, the very room where I'd had that final, painful confrontation with Mark and Clarissa. Sunlight streamed in, warming my face. I was reading a new novel, a cup of herbal tea steaming beside me. The house was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence now, filled not with ghosts of unspoken resentments, but with a sense of calm and self-possession. I looked around at the familiar objects, the photographs of Arthur, the comfortable chairs, the thriving plants. This was my home, truly mine again. The feeling of being a burden and inconvenience, the widow to be managed and silenced, had vanished completely. I had been underestimated, yes. They had seen my grief, my age, my quiet nature as weaknesses. They had failed to see the strength forged in a lifetime of love and partnership, the resolve tempered by loss, and the power that lay dormant within the legal frameworks Arthur had so carefully constructed. The "shut up, you widow" remark had been their fatal miscalculation. It had been the spark that ignited a fire they never anticipated. Looking back, I felt no lingering bitterness, surprisingly little anger. What remained was a profound sense of vindication, not a desire for revenge, but the deep satisfaction of justice served, of balance restored. I had reclaimed my dignity, my home, my husband's legacy, and most importantly, my peace of mind. Arthur's Fine Furnishings, under David Henderson's careful stewardship and my oversight, was beginning to flourish again, returning to the principles of quality and craftsmanship that Arthur had championed. We even rehired a couple of the older craftsmen Mark had tried to force into early retirement. There was a waiting list for our bespoke pieces once more. As for the house on Willow Creek Lane, I eventually decided to rent it to a young family, a doctor and a teacher with two small children. Their laughter now echoed in the rooms that had once held such unhappiness, and that felt right. My life was smaller now, in some ways, quieter, but it was also richer, more authentic. I had learned that true wealth isn't measured in assets or social standing, but in peace, self-respect, and the quiet joy of a life lived on one's own terms. The widow they tried to silence had found her voice, and in doing so, had found her freedom. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was still, I would swear I could almost hear Arthur's gentle chuckle, a sound of approval, of love, echoing in the quiet, peaceful rooms. He would have understood. He always did. And that, in the end, was all the vindication I truly needed.